God, it was an unforgettable day, I can tell you that. By all accounts, it was supposed to be a regular Saturday night dinner. Even young Brian was there, staying with us for the weekend, as she often did. I suppose I'd better explain why Brian was there. Brian's mother, Andorra, who by the way I'd never met at the time, was a widow and worked almost every weekend as a cab controller. Meliora and Brian had become best friends in high school, and from then on, it was common for them to sleep over at each other's houses. Eventually, it became standard procedure, with Brian sleeping over on Fridays and Saturdays, while her mother worked 12-hour night shifts and carved out a few hours to sleep during the day. Marge, Meliora's mother and my ex-wife, obviously knew Andorra well, but to be honest, I never saw her at the time. Not for any particular reason that I can name, except that Marge thought the lovely Andorra would turn my head. It was just the way things were. I was traveling a lot at the time. The company I was working for was young, and we were trying to grab a piece of the market that had been tightly packed with other suppliers for years. As it happened, Marge was dropping off and picking up the kids all the time. On Sundays, though, Brian was often picked up from our house in any of the cabs that passed by. I think Brian liked that the cab drivers who came to pick her up were spoiled with sweets, ice cream, etc. Meliora didn't mind either. She usually got the same treats they did. Where was I? Yes, that infamous Saturday night dinner. The four of us were sitting around the table eating. Marge had just served us sweets, and I think I had just returned to the table after putting away the main course dishes in the kitchen. Anyway, without thinking about the fact that there were two girls sitting with us, and without any prior warning or preparation, Marge suddenly announced, "Pete, I want a divorce. I'm leaving you." Then she settled into her seat, like she hadn't just dropped the biggest bombshell she could think of on my head. Excuse me? I think that was the extent of my initial response. When your wife, with whom you have lived for 10 years, suddenly makes a statement like that in a casual conversation, your first reaction is to wonder if your ears have deceived you. I said I want a divorce. I found someone else, and I want to spend the rest of my life with him. And what the hell could I possibly say to such a statement? The room fell into a stunned silence. Meliora and Brian exchanged wide-eyed glances, their mouths hanging open in shock. I could feel the blood draining from my face as I struggled to process Marge's words. "Marge, are you serious?" I finally managed to stammer. She nodded, her expression resolute. "Yes, Pete, I'm serious. I've thought about this for a long time. I can't continue living a lie. I want to be happy, and I think I deserve that." My mind was racing, trying to catch up with the reality that was unfolding before me. But who is he? How long has this been going on? His name is Roger. We've been seeing each other for about a year now. He's kind, supportive, and he makes me feel alive again. I felt a wave of anger and betrayal wash over me. A year? You've been having an affair for a year, and you never thought to mention it. Marge sighed, her patience clearly wearing thin. Pete, I didn't want to hurt you, but now I realize that living a lie is hurting both of us even more. The girls were still staring at us, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. I looked at Meliora, her eyes brimming with tears. "Dad, what's going to happen now?" she whispered. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure for her sake. "We'll figure it out, Meliora. I promise." Marge stood up, her decision clearly made. "I'm going to pack some things and stay with Roger for a while. We'll talk more about the details later." She walked out of the dining room, leaving a deafening silence in her wake. I turned to Meliora and Brian, both of them looking to me for some sort of reassurance. "Girls, I'm so sorry you had to hear that," I said, my voice shaking. "We'll get through this, I promise." Brian, ever the supportive friend, reached over and took Meliora's hand. "It's going to be okay, Meliora. We're here for you." That night was a blur of emotions. I spent hours talking to Meliora, trying to reassure her that everything would be all right, even though I wasn't sure of it myself. When she finally fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room, my mind racing with thoughts of the future. My marriage was over. My life was about to change in ways I couldn't even begin to fathom, and I had no idea what the next steps would be. But one thing was certain. I had to be strong for my daughter. No matter what happened, I had to make sure she felt loved and supported. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I made a silent vow to myself that I would do whatever it took to rebuild our lives and find a new sense of normalcy. Not forgetting, of course, that there were two impressionable 8-year-old girls sitting at the table with us, one of whom was our daughter, watching my every word and physical action. I believe that under the circumstances, I displayed the exceptional self-control and patience of a saint. Upon reflection, I have always been proud of the self-control I displayed. I sat there for a while, going over Marge's words in my mind, until I convinced myself that I wasn't crazy, that she just said she wanted me out of her life. I must have made some stupid statement like, "If that's the case, I'm going apartment hunting tomorrow," or something like that. Remember, I was in a state of shock at the time, so my recollection of the details is probably somewhat faulty. Anyway, I said something about moving out of the house, but Marge came back with a real hammy. "No, you'll have to keep the house. I won't need it, and you'll need it for Meliora." I stopped pretending to eat the rapidly melting ice cream on my plate and stared at Alethea. "We're going on a trip around the world, and Meliora, at her age, can't afford to miss all her schoolwork," added Marge nonchalantly, not even raising her eyes from her dish. "You've got to be kidding me," I replied in a rather louder voice than I intended. Look, I wasn't holding back my emotions for Marge's sake, but for the sake of the two impressionable girls at the table with us. On reflection, Marge probably decided to make her statement during the meal because she knew full well that I would hold back in front of the children. "I want to see the world while I'm still young enough to enjoy it," replied Alethea, completely unaware of the irony in her words. At this point, words failed me, and if it weren't for the seriousness of the situation, I might well have burst into laughter. You see, when Marge and I first met, I was very passionate about traveling. I grew up with the plan that when I finished my engineering degree, I would travel the world for a few years before settling down. When Marge came into my life, I saw no need to change that plan. I imagined Marge and I traveling to exotic places together. Marge, however, saw things a little differently. Yes, like me, she longed to see the world, the Grand Canyon, the Rocky Mountains, and the huge redwood trees that grow there. We even talked about places like Ayers Rock in Oz and the North Island of New Zealand with its boiling mud pools and geysers. A buddy of mine from New Zealand used to tell us about his ski trips to the South Island. But as time went on, Marge's enthusiasm for our travel plans waned. She started to make excuses, small at first, about why we couldn't take a trip this year or why next year would be better. Eventually, the excuses became more frequent and varied. There was always some reason not to go, some responsibility or fear that held her back. So now, sitting at that dinner table, hearing her talk about traveling the world, I couldn't believe the audacity. "Marge, we planned to travel together for years, but you always found a reason not to go. Now, suddenly, you're ready to take off around the globe with someone else?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. She looked at me, finally meeting my eyes, and said, "I just wasn't ready then, Pete, but I am now, and I don't want to waste any more time." Meliora and Brian were still staring wide-eyed, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm for their sake. "Fine, Marge. If that's what you want, then go. I'll take care of Meliora. We'll be just fine." Marge stood up, leaving her untouched dessert behind. "Thank you, Pete. I'll pack my things tonight and be out of your way by morning." As she left the room, I turned to Meliora and Brian, who both looked like they were about to cry. "Hey, it's going to be okay," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll get through this together." Brian reached over and took Meliora's hand, giving her a supportive squeeze. "Yeah, Meliora, we're here for you." The rest of the night passed in a blur. I helped Meliora get ready for bed, reassuring her as best as I could. When she finally fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room, my mind racing with thoughts of the future. My marriage was over, and everything I had known was about to change. But as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I made a silent vow to myself. I would be strong for Meliora. I would rebuild our lives and find a new sense of normalcy, and we would be okay, no matter what. That night marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, filled with uncertainty but also with hope. And as I looked forward, I knew that with determination and love, we would face whatever came our way, together. It always sounded fun, at least a little more exotic than the Alps. But Marge had a slightly different game plan than I did. I assumed that we would get married and leave as soon as we got our diplomas, using the savings that we had managed to stash away. I figured we'd travel for a couple of years or so and then come back to the UK, settle down and have kids. That's assuming we didn't find another place we wanted to settle while traveling. Marge planned to have children first. Ironically, while I'm young enough to enjoy them, was exactly what she said. Irony or what? At the time, I thought I understood Marge's position. Her parents were already quite old when her mother gave birth to her, and she was always aware of that fact. Anyway, Marge's idea was that when the kids were out of the nest, we would travel the world together. Apparently, Alethea had changed her mind. Maybe taking care of Meliora wasn't as much fun as she thought it would be. I know that the pregnancy and the birth itself were not to her liking. The idea of having 3 children was quickly dropped from the master plan as soon as Meliora was born, without much discussion with anyone that I was aware of. I think that's when I almost broke down, but I couldn't laugh out loud, although in retrospect, I should have. I couldn't sit there and listen to Marge's ramblings any longer, or I'm sure I would have snapped and done something I'd regret for a long time. I just got up from the table and went out into the garden, where for some reason, probably out of habit, and because it was just a job that had to be done, I started pruning the roses. I don't know how long it was before I realized I had company. First, I noticed Brian's hand. I think she had started trimming the bush next to the one I was working on. Then I noticed Meliora working on the bush on the other side of me. Neither of the girls said anything to signal their arrival. "Watch out for thorns, girls. You're not wearing gardening gloves," I automatically warned. "We'll be careful, Dad," replied Meliora. "What does your mom do?" I asked, as if offhandedly. I don't know why I asked my daughter that, but it was another automatic response. "I think she's upstairs packing," Meliora replied calmly, as if this was a common occurrence. Suddenly, I was so angry again that I couldn't keep pruning the damn roses. I was afraid that if I did, I would rip off the fresh flowers as well. I stepped back and watched the girls. True, I wanted to rush upstairs and throw Alethea out, but not so much for announcing out of the blue that she was leaving me, rather for the sheer audacity and insensitivity of doing it in front of our daughter and her friend. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm brewing inside me. "Well, if she's packing, that means we have some time to ourselves," I said, forcing a smile. "How about we finish up here and then go inside for some ice cream?" The girls nodded, their faces lighting up at the mention of ice cream. We finished trimming the bushes, and I marveled at their resilience and ability to adapt to the situation. It was a trait I hoped would serve them well in life. Inside, we made ourselves ice cream sundaes, piling on the toppings and laughing as we tried to see who could make the most outrageous creation. For a moment, the tension of the evening was forgotten, replaced by the simple joy of spending time together. After the girls went to bed, I sat in the living room, the weight of the day settling heavily on my shoulders. Marge had made her decision, and there was no turning back. I had to focus on what was best for Meliora and me. Our lives were about to change dramatically, but I was determined to make the best of it. The next morning, Marge left without much fanfare. Meliora and I watched from the window as she climbed into a cab, her suitcase in tow. Brian's mother had come to pick her up earlier, offering a few words of sympathy before they left. As the cab drove away, Meliora turned to me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What are we going to do now, Dad?" I knelt down beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to be okay, Meliora. We'll take it one day at a time. We'll figure things out together." She nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart," I replied, pulling her into a tight hug. In the days that followed, we began to adjust to our new reality. I took on more responsibilities at home, making sure Meliora had everything she needed. We developed a routine, finding comfort in the familiar while embracing the changes that came our way. It wasn't easy, but we managed, and through it all, we grew closer, our bond strengthening with each passing day. I I realized that while our plans had changed, the most important thing remained the same: our love for each other. As time went on, I found myself reflecting less on the past and more on the future. I started to see the possibilities that lay ahead, the new adventures we could embark on together. And with Meliora by my side, I knew that whatever came our way, we would face it with courage and determination. Our journey was just beginning, and though the road ahead was uncertain, I felt a sense of hope and excitement. We were a team, and together, we would navigate the twists and turns of life, finding joy in the unexpected and strength in our unbreakable bond. The fact that she had effectively declared to our daughter that she didn't want Meliora to go with her was incomprehensible to me. I couldn't understand how any mother, much less my wife, could do that to her child. "Sorry, Meliora," I said without any further explanation. "Why, Daddy?" "You didn't decide to leave us. Mom did," my daughter replied, obviously understanding the point of my apology. "Most of the kids at school have dads who have left. I'd rather stay with a dad who loves me than a mom who—" Meliora didn't finish the sentence, and I still wonder what she meant to say. I've always wondered, but I suppose I'll never know what I've missed over the years. Could Alethea have somehow let Meliora know that she didn't love her? Marge always seemed to me to be a loving mother to Meliora. She also seemed to tenderly care for Brian whenever she was in the house. But if I was blind enough not to notice that my wife had a gorgeous man stashed away somewhere, I had to wonder what else I was missing. Perhaps Alethea's actions conveyed to Meliora that her mother didn't love her simply because she didn't take her along. Suddenly, I noticed that both girls were working together on the same rose bush. Moreover, they were holding hands. One was pulling out dead rose heads, and the other was taking them from her and throwing them into a basket. Almost at the same moment, I realized I could hear Alethea talking to someone, probably her new man, on the phone in the bedroom. The windows were open because the day was warm. I couldn't hear what she was saying to him, but knowing that children often have much better hearing than adults, I figured the girls could probably hear every word. "Ice cream," I announced loudly. "Come on, girls, let's get ourselves the biggest ice cream we can find, shall we?" I knew they had just had ice cream for dessert. My own had melted on the plate, but it was the best idea my confused brain could come up with on such short notice. Both girls burst into joyful shouts and immediately seemed to forget about the roses, cheering each other on. I had never noticed them doing this before. I found myself walking to the car with an 8-year-old girl galloping on either side of me, each holding onto one of my hands. To make it a little more special, I didn't take the girls to one of the local fast food places. We didn't have a proper ice cream parlor in our town, so instead, I went to one of the nicer restaurants that served elaborate sundaes. As we entered, the girls' eyes widened in awe at the sight of the huge, colorful ice cream creations displayed on the menu. We ordered 3 of the largest sundaes they offered, each piled high with scoops of various flavors: whipped cream, nuts, cherries, and chocolate syrup. The girls' faces lit up with excitement as the waiter brought our orders, and their earlier worries seemed to melt away with each bite of the decadent dessert. We laughed and joked, making a mess, but enjoying every moment. It was a small victory, a brief escape from the chaos that Marge had brought into our lives. As I watched Meliora and Brian savor their ice cream, I felt a surge of determination. I would do everything in my power to ensure that Meliora felt loved and secure, no matter how challenging the road ahead might be. By the time we left the restaurant, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the town. The girls, full and content, held onto my hands as we walked back to the car. I knew we still had a long way to go, but for the first time that day, I felt a glimmer of hope. We would get through this. We would find our way. Back home, I tucked the girls into bed, reading them a story until they both drifted off to sleep. As I closed the bedroom door, I took a deep breath and allowed myself a moment of reflection. Life had thrown us a curveball, but we had managed to find a small slice of happiness amidst the turmoil. In the days that followed, Meliora and I began to settle into a new routine. I took on more responsibilities at home, ensuring that she had everything she needed. We developed a rhythm, finding solace in the stability of our new life together. Marge had made her choice, and we had to live with the consequences. But as I watched Meliora grow stronger and more resilient each day, I knew that we were going to be okay. The love we shared would guide us through the uncertainty and lead us to brighter days ahead. How wrong I was. It took some time for them to absorb the situation, and that proved to be helpful to me. I began to get over the shock of Alethia's sudden announcement and come to terms with what Marge was doing to us, evaluating both the immediate and long-term consequences. For some inexplicable reason, I found that I personally didn't care that Alethea was leaving. Yes, I would miss her, but any love I had for this woman was instantly destroyed by her announcement and the way she did it in front of Meliora. But with her leaving, I had a big problem: childcare. I was sure I could look after Meliora, but I needed someone to take her to and from school every day. I was confident my employers would help in any way they could, but our work hours were 9 to 5, while school hours were 9 to 3. And who the hell was going to look after Meliora during the vacations? Brian? Well, I was sorry, but I had my own problems, and her mother would have to deal with hers as best she could. I remember thinking that I would have to call her later and explain the situation. The only plan I could think of was my sister. Carol lived pretty far away, but maybe she could somehow pick Meliora up from school in the afternoons, even if it meant a long drive for both of us. The only drawback I could see was Carol's own children. Perhaps they were finishing school at the same time as Meliora. I pulled out my cell phone and called Carol. Maybe if I threw the ball into her court, she'd come up with some plan. Carol was always pretty good at this sort of thing. "What did she do?" shouted Carol into my phone as I explained Alethea's statement as briefly as possible, trying not to go into details, what I knew of them, because the girls were sitting at the table with me. I was actually surprised myself at how little I had learned from what Alethea had said. I had no idea how long her affair had lasted, and I didn't even know who she'd had it with. "Carol, I told you Marge ran off with some guy and left us." "Who? What guy?" demanded Carol. "I have no idea, Carol. Just some Casanova she picked up somewhere, I guess. I didn't bother to ask." "His name is Ronald," announced Meliora, taking me by surprise. "He's a library customer," added Brian, apparently not wanting to fall behind. Marge had been working part-time at the library for months, just to make money and get out of the house, so she said. I took a deep breath, trying to absorb this new information. "Okay, Carol, his name is Ronald, and he's a library customer. That's all I know." "Unbelievable," Carol muttered. "Okay, let's focus on Meliora for now. I'll figure out a way to help. Maybe I can rearrange my schedule, or we can work out a carpool with some of the other parents. Don't worry, we'll make it work." "Thanks, Carol. I really appreciate it," I said, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. After hanging up, I looked at the girls, who were still sitting at the table, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. "All right, girls, let's get back to our ice cream mission," I said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. We piled into the car and headed to the restaurant that served the best sundaes in town. As we walked in, the girls' faces lit up, their earlier worries momentarily forgotten. We ordered the largest sundaes they had, and the girls' excitement was contagious. For a little while, the sweetness of the ice cream helped to mask the bitterness of the day's events. Sitting there, watching Meliora and Brian enjoy their sundaes, I felt a sense of resolve. Marge had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. I would be there for Meliora, no matter what. We would figure out a new routine, find new ways to make it work, and build a new life together. And I would ensure that Meliora knew she was loved every single day. As we finished our sundaes, the girls' faces sticky with ice cream and smiles, I felt a glimmer of hope. We would get through this. It wouldn't be easy, but we had each other, and that was enough. We drove home with the windows down, the cool evening air rushing in, and the girls singing along to their favorite songs on the radio. It was a small moment of joy, a reminder that life goes on, even when it feels like it's falling apart. That night, after tucking Meliora into bed, I sat down at the kitchen table, my mind racing with thoughts of the future. There were so many uncertainties, so many challenges ahead. But I knew one thing for sure. I would do whatever it took to give Meliora the best life possible. We would face the challenges together, and we would come out stronger on the other side. I stared at the two girls, who were still sitting there, nonchalantly devouring their giant popsicles while repeating their words to Carol. But my problem is, Carol, I have no idea what I'm going to do about picking up Meliora from school every day. I can drop her off in the mornings and get into the office a little later, but there's no way I can finish at 2:30 every day. It's okay, Daddy. Brian's mom is picking me up from school, Meliora pointed out with the logic of a child before Carol could respond. It wouldn't be fair to ask her to do that every day, Meliora, I tried to explain to her. That won't be a problem, Meliora informed me. We've thought of everything, haven't we, Brian? Brian looked up from her ice cream, nodded, and then smirked at me. Somehow, I realized for the first time that these two girls were quietly conspiring with each other. But where they found the time or the opportunity that day, I had no idea. Brian will stay at our house on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, Meliora explained. And I'll stay with Brian and her mom the rest of the school nights. On Mondays, you can drive us to school, and Brian's mom will pick us up when she gets out of bed after lunch. Meliora threw me one of those childishly satisfied, easy and simple problem-solved looks. I don't know what expression was on my face as I sat there in amazement. Carol must have overheard Meliora's words, however, because she said, I think it's a brilliant plan, Pete. Did you ask her? No, Carol. For some reason, I never thought of that. I've never met Brian's mother, and the idea never crossed my mind. Frankly, I have no idea if she would agree to it. It's too big a request. The cab driver has been asking my mom to work on Sundays for a while now. Brian suddenly joined the conversation. Mom said that by working on Sundays in the cab, she'd get more money than at the store. But she didn't want to impose on Mama Meliora by asking her to look after me. Reading between the lines of Brian's words, I realized that her mother must be working part-time at the store sometime during the week. God, that woman must work around the clock, I thought to myself. I think the kids have solved your problem, Carol said. What does Meliora's friend's mother look like? I have no idea. You know, I've never met the lady, Carol, I replied. Well, it's high time you did, Carol suggested. Why don't you invite her over for coffee or something? Get to know her and see if she's on board with this arrangement. Taking Carol's advice to heart, I decided to take action. After Meliora and Brian finished their ice creams, I gathered the girls and we drove over to Brian's house. I felt a knot of nervousness in my stomach as we approached the door, but I knew this was a necessary step. Brian's mother, Andorra, answered the door with a warm smile, though she looked understandably tired. Hi, you must be Pete, she said, extending her hand. I've heard so much about you from Brian and Meliora. Nice to meet you, Andorra, I replied, shaking her hand. I wanted to talk to you about something important. Do you have a few minutes? Of course, come on in, she said, stepping aside to let us enter. We sat in her cozy living room, the girls scampering off to play in the next room. I explained the situation to Andorra, laying out the plan the girls had concocted. I know it's a big request, I concluded, but it seems like it could work out well for all of us. Of course, only if you're comfortable with it. Andorra listened intently, her expression thoughtful. Honestly, Pete, I think it's a great idea. It would make things easier for me, too. I appreciate your openness and willingness to work together on this. A wave of relief washed over me. Thank you, Andorra. This means a lot. Let's give it a try and see how it works, she said with a reassuring smile. From that moment on, our lives began to adapt to the new arrangement. The girls were thrilled, and it brought a sense of stability and support that we all needed. Over time, I got to know Andorra better, and we developed a mutual respect and understanding. As the weeks went by, I found that the challenge of balancing work and parenting became more manageable. I still missed Marge, but the pain of her departure lessened as Meliora and I settled into our new routine. The support from Andorra and Carol was invaluable, and I realized that sometimes unexpected changes can lead to positive outcomes. Our little community grew stronger, and despite the upheaval, we found new ways to support each other. Life had thrown us a curveball, but with determination and the help of those around us, we learned to hit it out of the park. I had to be very careful with my words, knowing full well that the two little innocents on the other side of the table were scrutinizing my every word. Their curious eyes tracked every movement, and their ears caught every nuance. "Well, brother, I'd say you'd better go over there and have a chat with Brian's mother as soon as possible," I advised, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. "Find out what she thinks of the children's plan." Switching gears, Carol, never one to hold back, bluntly asked, "Has that bitch moved out of the house yet?" "I have no idea, Carol," I replied honestly. "The girls and I are at a restaurant in town. I took them out for ice cream earlier. But yeah, I think she was packing up when we left." "You'd better get some new door locks while you're in town," Carol suggested, her voice tinged with concern. "I'm sure you don't need that cow trying to come back. Call me later if you need anything tonight, Pete. Frank and I can come over if you want, but if we both come, we'll have to bring the kids with us." "Thank you, Carol, but I don't think it will be necessary," I said, appreciating her offer, but feeling overwhelmed. "You know, I think all the help I'm going to need this evening is sitting here with me right now." The two girls exchanged grins, first with each other, then with me, and finally back to each other. This playful exchange was something I'd see many times over the next few months. At the time, though, I had no idea what the little tricksters were really up to. Another thing I hadn't noticed was Carol's lack of surprise at Alethea leaving me. She wasn't particularly upset about it either. I wouldn't say the two women got along well. In fact, they could hardly be called close friends. After finishing the ice cream, we headed back to the car, but I still didn't go home. I had a rather delicate mission to accomplish first. I needed to inform Brian's mother that I would be the only adult in the house with the girls that evening, and make sure she was okay with it. With some of the strange personalities these days, I wanted to cover all bases. I pulled up outside the cab office, leaving the girls in the car, and went inside to find Brian's mother. "My name is Pete Thomas," I said, addressing the cabbie behind the counter. "I'm looking for young Brian's mother." The cabbie looked up, seeming to vaguely remember me from picking Brian up one Sunday afternoon. At the time, I realized I had no idea what Brian's mother's actual name was. Marge and Meliora always referred to her as Brian's mother, and Brian herself simply called her Mom. A few guys, obviously cab drivers on break, were hanging around, adding to the peculiar atmosphere of the place. The men were sitting in old armchairs, drinking tea or coffee, their eyes immediately snapping to me as soon as I mentioned Brian. The room's focus shifted from the TV in the corner to me, and conversations halted abruptly at the sound of her name. "She is currently in her private office and will be back soon," the guy behind the counter said with a smile, gesturing towards a door with a "Ladies Only" sign. However, someone had cheekily pasted a piece of paper over it that read, "Andorra Office." I stood there, trying to appear nonchalant, despite feeling the weight of everyone's gaze upon me. It felt like an eternity before the door finally opened, and I got the surprise of my life. I had no idea what to expect when seeing Brian's mother for the first time, but it certainly wasn't this. She wasn't dressed to the nines. In fact, she wore a pair of old, tight-fitting jeans and an equally snug blue blouse. But damn, she had that kind of beauty that would shine through any outfit. Her makeup was flawless, accentuating her features without being overdone, and her hair was perfectly styled. She looked like a runway model, gliding with grace and style. I suddenly understood why the drivers had shown so much interest when I asked about her, and why they were all lingering around the office. "Andorra, there's a guy here to see you," the man behind the counter called out. "Hey, Pete, is something wrong?" she asked, a wide smile on her face, but a hint of concern in her voice. "Yeah, no, well, maybe," I stammered, glancing nervously at the guys who were now pretending not to eavesdrop. "Brian is fine, and there's nothing to worry about. I just thought I should let you know what's going on, that's all. Can we talk somewhere private?" Instantly, the men started to rise from their seats, ready to give us privacy. But Andorra waved them off, and we stepped outside. "What's up, Peter? You don't look too smart," Andorra teased as the door closed behind us. Then she noticed the girls huddled against the car window and waved at them. "The problem is, Andorra, Alethea left me," I stammered, feeling strange talking to her and even using her name since this was our first proper meeting. Her expression softened, and she reached out, placing a comforting hand on my arm. "I'm sorry to hear that, Pete, but I'm sure you'll get through it," she said, her voice gentle and reassuring. I took a deep breath, grateful for her understanding. Thanks, Endora. I just wanted to make sure you knew that I'd be the only adult with the girls tonight, and I hope that's okay with you. She nodded, her eyes kind and supportive. Of course, Pete. I trust you. If there's anything you need, just let me know. Feeling a weight lift off my shoulders, I smiled back at her. Thank you, Endora. That means a lot. As we headed back to the car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. For the first time in what felt like ages, I had someone on my side. And somehow, I knew that everything was going to be okay. I was puzzled when she recognized me instantly, knowing exactly who I was, despite being certain that we had never met before. My God, poor thing, was her initial reaction. Then, as the reality of the situation sank in, she asked, "Does this mean we have a childcare problem tonight?" "No, Endora," I replied, still grappling with her name. "It's just that we've never met." And I thought, well, I don't know what I thought. I just wanted to let you know that I'll be watching the kids alone tonight. I thought it was important for you to know, considering we're complete strangers. Not so much, Peter, she responded warmly. Brian talks about you all the time. You may not realize it, but she treats you like a surrogate father. She even has a picture of you next to a picture of my husband by her bed. My God, where did she get that? I asked, astonished. Oddly gave it to her, I guess. Anyway, do you want me to take the day off and take the girls or something? I can if you want to be alone. God, no. No, I just thought it would be wise to let you know the situation. If they hadn't come this afternoon, I'd have been in a complete mess. I'm fine looking after Brian. I just wanted you to be aware. I'm sure Brian couldn't be in better hands, Peter, she said, reaching out to take my hand reassuringly. I'll come and get Brian in the morning. No, you need to get some sleep. 5 hours as usual would be just fine. But maybe you can stop by and see me on your own, because we really need to discuss what's going to happen in the future. If you want, I can bring Brian home, I offered, starting to feel the weight of the future pressing down on me. Yes, the future, Endora replied, her face growing more concerned as she contemplated the long-term consequences of Alethea leaving me. Don't worry, I think we can work something out. The girls are already full of ideas. I smiled at her as best I could, trying to convey a sense of hope. Endora looked a bit relieved. Yes, but I'll take Brian. I'm sure you'll have plenty of things you need to focus on. Thank you. Yes, I guess that's the way it is. If only I could figure them out. I'll see you tomorrow night then, I said, feeling a mix of relief and anticipation for the conversation that awaited us. And please don't worry about Brian. She's a wonderful girl. Aren't they both? Endora commented as we walked to the car. She had a brief word with the girls, kissing them goodnight and telling them to behave themselves. When we pulled up to the house, an unfamiliar car was parked in my driveway. Alethea got out of it just as I pulled up to the curb. Where have you been? I've been waiting here for you for hours, she demanded, her tone sharp and impatient. She curtly informed us that she was on her way out. Honestly, even after the bombshell she had dropped on me earlier, I couldn't reconcile her behavior and speech with the woman I had been married to for so long. If this is who I think it is, I suggest you tell the bastard to get his car out of my driveway before I move it for him, I responded just as sharply. My patience was worn thin, and I was extremely annoyed with Alethea for having this guy there when we got back. What a way to rub my nose in it, I thought. In retrospect, I think I had impeccable control of my emotions that day, mostly because the kids were around, but it seemed to me that Alethea was trying to provoke me, perhaps to use it as some kind of justification for her actions. Alethea made a dismissive gesture with her hand, and the Jaguar started up with a roar, then slid out of the driveway and parked across the street. Ignoring Alethea standing next to the car, I put mine in reverse and swung across the street to back into the spot where the Jaguar had been parked. Alethea complained that I almost hit her as I got out of the car. You're still here? I thought you left, I lied and walked to the front door. But then I stopped and turned to look at her. Aren't you taking this? I demanded, gesturing to the little Nissan that Alethea usually drove. It suddenly popped into my mind that the Jaguar was stuffed to the brim with Alethea's stuff, while the Nissan was empty. I don't see the point. You'd better sell it. We're flying out of the country on Wednesday, she replied coldly. Where? I thought. wondering where I would send the divorce papers. But Alithia beat me to it. Ronnie's lawyer's address is on the kitchen table. He'll know where to contact us, she replied curtly, then turned to speak to Meliora. I felt a mix of anger and relief as I processed her words. There was a finality to them that both hurt and offered a strange sense of closure. This chapter of my life was coming to an end, but I knew I had to stay strong for the girls. By the time Brian and Meliora had gotten out of the car, I had already started towards the house. I didn't wait to see what Alithia had to say to them, and my daughter and I have never discussed it since. It couldn't have been anything significant because a few seconds later, both girls followed me into the house, shutting the door tightly behind them. What I didn't see, but heard in the back of my mind, was the distinct slap of their hands as the little devils high-fived each other. At that moment, I didn't pay any attention to the sound, too engrossed in my thoughts to notice their silent celebration. The girls and I settled down on the couch to watch some TV. After a while, I told them it was time for bed. They both gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and went to bed without any argument, a rare occurrence, especially for Meliora. I have no idea what time I ended up going to bed. I admit, I had a couple of whiskeys that night to help me sleep. Sunday morning, I awoke to the familiar and comforting smell of frying bacon wafting through the house. For a moment, I forgot that Alithia had left and looked at the clock, wondering if she had gotten up early. Then, the memories of the previous day washed over me, and I looked around the room, sensing something was off. The room looked too neat, too orderly. When I had gone to bed, there had been signs of Alithia's departure everywhere. Half-open dresser drawers, ajar closet doors. Now, not only were they closed, but all traces of Alithia's existence seemed to have vanished. Even the pictures of her parents, which I distinctly remembered seeing the night before, were gone from the dressing table, leaving it bare. I got out of bed and headed to the bathroom. To my even greater surprise, all the personal items that Alithia had left behind were gone as well. I had to assume that while I slept, someone had cleaned up. There were only two possible culprits. "Come on, Dad, is breakfast getting cold?" I heard Meliora call from the stairs as I walked out of my bedroom. Waiting for me in the kitchen were both 8-year-olds, insisting I sit down while they served breakfast. They had prepared fried eggs, a glass of fresh orange juice, and a cup of coffee, presenting it as if I were at an upscale hotel. The two girls settled for cornflakes, orange juice, and tea. I made the requisite enthusiastic comments about the fine breakfast and the skill of the chefs, rewarded with broad smiles on their faces. Their happiness was contagious, lifting some of the heaviness from my heart. As we were finishing our meal, Carol, her husband Frank, and their children arrived. The house felt unexpectedly full of life and laughter, a stark contrast to the chaos and sadness of the previous day. This impromptu visit was exactly what I needed, and I couldn't have been more grateful for their support. Their arrival broke the enchantment and calm a bit, but it was clear that their presence had been anticipated. The girls had either planned ahead or greatly overestimated my coffee consumption, as Meliora and Brian quickly set down Carol and Frank's coffee mugs. It took some coaxing to convince the two girls to leave the dishwashing to me and go play with Carol's kids. Carol busied herself with the dishes, while Frank and I sat drinking coffee, watching the lively scene unfold. I detailed the previous day's events to them, grateful for their supportive presence. My sister and her husband told me they would do everything they could to help, I shared, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. Frank handed me the name and details of the lawyer who had represented his sister in her divorce. She turned out to be an excellent choice, just as he had assured me. Carol, ever the caretaker, made dinner for everyone using what she found in the freezer and refrigerator. I spent most of the day tending to my roses when I wasn't talking to Carol and Frank. One moment that stood out was when Brian and Meliora helped me with the roses in the afternoon. I remember Brian, either by coincidence or on purpose, quoting a line from the song, "It's been a good year for the roses." She was too young to understand the parallels between the song and the previous day's events, but I certainly did. I don't know if I reacted visibly when Brian said those words, but I do know that, consciously or not, Brian has repeated that phrase often over the years. Both girls seem to love the song, and we hear them playing or singing it quite frequently, especially when someone mentions Alethea. Around 4:30, a cab pulled up to the house, and Endora got out. The girls let her into the house, and we got acquainted. Then Carol, Endora, and I went into the living room while Frank ushered all the children into the garden to keep them busy. Endora felt sorry for what had happened, and before I could say anything, Carol informed her of the girls' plan for babysitting. Endora confirmed that she had mentioned to Brian in passing that she had been asked to work as a supervisor on the Sunday night shift at the taxi stand. She added that she would earn more money this way than working 4 morning hours at the local convenience store where she was employed. Without much further discussion or change, we decided to follow the plan the children had outlined the night before. There was some vague discussion about Carol helping with daycare for both girls a couple of days a week during school vacations, etc. As the evening settled in, I felt a sense of relief and gratitude. The support from Carol, Frank, and even Endora was more than I could have hoped for. It gave me the strength to face the uncertain days ahead, knowing I wasn't alone in this challenging time. Endora called the boss of the taxi company to check if she could take an extra shift. He was obviously over the moon and asked her to start work that very evening. She glanced at me for some reason, seeking confirmation. I just smiled and nodded, so she agreed. It wasn't that simple, though, because Brian needed school clothes for the next day. Carol drove Endora and Brian home to pick them up, and Meliora insisted on going with them. As I carried Brian's bag into the house from Carol and Frank's car, a thought struck me. "Endora, do you drive?" I asked. "Yeah, but since Tony left, I can't afford to keep a car," she replied. "How do you like the little Micra as a get-around car?" I asked. Endora stopped and looked at Alethea's car parked beside the road. "I can't," she replied. "Why not?" "Since Alethea doesn't need it, she told me to get rid of the damn thing. You'll need it too, since you're going to be racing Meliora to and from school every day." "Are you sure?" she asked, her eyes wide with surprise. "Come on," I insisted. "Let's call the insurance company and put you on my policy as a driver. We'll put Alethea on my policy too and let Ronald the rat deal with all her insurance." "His name is Ronald, Dad," Meliora corrected me. "Who cares what his name is? He's a Roland rat to me," I replied, perhaps somewhat sharply. "He can't be, Dad. Roland rat is funny and cute," Meliora corrected me again. I couldn't argue with my daughter's logic, so I relented and changed my tune. "Okay, if you insist, it'll be Ronald the rat." I smiled at her, reminiscing about Roland Rat, the puppet character on a morning television news show at the time. Over the next few weeks, we all adjusted to the new routine. Carol, often with Frank and the kids, would show up on Saturday mornings to check the contents of the pantry and advise me on restocking it. She usually finished cooking lunch, unless we went out to eat. And yes, that's right, Carol never actually wore white gloves, but she did tend to make captain's rounds while she was in the house. Housework isn't exactly my forte, but I soon found that I didn't have much to do in the evenings when Meliora wasn't home. I tried to do little and often, and I think the house was almost always in sight. Carol's visits were a blessing, providing structure and support during a time of significant upheaval. As weeks turned into months, the new rhythm of our lives began to feel more natural. Endora handled the Micra with ease, and seeing her drive it brought a sense of normalcy back into our chaotic world. Brian and Meliora settled into their new routines, and their laughter became a constant reminder that, despite everything, we were going to be okay. Carol, at any rate, never found cause for criticism. On weekdays, I was lonely, but over time, I got used to it. Fridays, when I came home from work and found Endora and the girls there, it was wonderful. Very quickly, Endora started cooking food for all of us before she went to her Friday night shift. The bad times came during the week, especially when I came home from work to an empty house and woke up in the morning alone. Never mind the resentment I felt toward Alethea for what she had done. After all these years of marriage, suddenly waking up alone in bed every morning was a jarring adjustment. There were some complications with the divorce. Marge and her gorgeous man had left the country and were apparently traveling extensively. Judging from the difficulty Marge's attorney had in keeping in touch with her, It seemed her beau was intentionally trying to make things difficult. Eventually, I discovered that his very distraught wife was demanding that he pay child support for their children. I met with her one day when both she and my attorneys were meeting for a council of war. Frankly, I had my own problems and didn't want to get involved. I know she eventually managed to block all his accounts in British banks, and I believe she ultimately got all his assets in the UK. Without directly interfering, I helped by informing her attorney of Marge's whereabouts whenever she called home to speak to our daughter. Credit for obtaining that information must go to Meliora, who became adept at Marge's exact location when she called. Then, not very cleverly, the little rascal would pass that information on to me at the first opportunity. Whether Meliora knew the reason I needed that information or not, I don't know. Oddly enough, the difficulties Alethia's attorney was having worked to my advantage. During another court hearing, Alethia's solicitor asked the judge for yet another adjournment, claiming he was waiting to hear from Alethia on some matter. The judge, an old man with little patience left, lost his temper. He demanded to know where Alethia was, and when the poor solicitor had to admit that he had no idea, the judge turned to me. "Do you have any knowledge of her whereabouts?" he asked. "I'm sorry, sir," I replied, rising to my feet. "But I have not spoken or communicated directly with my wife since the day she decided to leave me and my daughter." I answered as best I could, glossing over the fact of Meliora's involvement, and since there had been no direct word between Alethia and me since her departure, I was telling the truth. This statement seemed to satisfy the judge, who then looked sternly at Alethia's solicitor. "I will not tolerate any more delays. You have 1 month to get in contact with your client. If you fail, I will proceed with the case in her absence." The courtroom was silent as his words sank in. I felt a small measure of vindication. Despite the chaos and the heartache, there was a glimmer of hope that this ordeal might finally come to an end. The support from Carol, Frank, and Dora, and especially Meliora, gave me the strength to navigate through these turbulent times. And though the future was uncertain, I felt a renewed sense of determination to face whatever lay ahead. I kind of forgot to mention that Alethia called Meliora every 3 weeks or so. But that's not what the judge asked me, is it? And you know how these lawyers push you to answer their questions unvarnished. I don't know exactly, but I have to assume the old man was having a bad day or something. Or maybe he was presiding over another divorce case involving Alethia's posh man and had lost his patience. Suddenly I heard him say, "Unreasonable behavior, my grounds for divorce, can be interpreted in many ways." He then briefly stated that Alethia's failure to communicate with her own attorney was one of them. He suggested that I had grounds to demand a divorce for desertion, but be that as it may, he immediately granted my claim and gave me full custody of Meliora. I don't see how joint custody of the child can work in this case. If Mrs. Thomas cannot effectively communicate with her legal representative on this matter, what chance does Mr. Thomas have of sharing with her the important decisions regarding their daughter's well-being? The judge lectured Alethia's counsel. "Mr. Thomas," the old man said, addressing me directly, "as of today, I grant you full and exclusive custody of Meliora. I fully terminate Mrs. Thomas's parental rights to the child, but with one caveat." He then turned to Alethia's attorney. "If Mrs. Thomas wishes to appear before me in person within 21 days, I may be able to persuade her to reconsider her decision. Will you endeavor to inform her of this?" Alethia's solicitor replied that he would do his best to give her the information. Hearing the poor man's reply, the judge raised his eyebrows and turned his attention back to me. "Well, Mr. Thomas, I don't hold out much hope of that happening, and I doubt I can be persuaded to change my mind. It surprises me that you haven't demanded child support from your wife. Frankly, I don't see much chance of collecting it, Your Honor, unless Alethia ever returns to the country," I replied. The judge leaned forward and spoke briefly in a whisper to his secretary, then shuffled through some papers, looking for something on his desk. "I think we'll still make a temporary order for £100 a month. It's only a nominal amount to set a precedent. Like you, I doubt very much whether you will ever get it. But if Mrs. Thomas returns to the jurisdiction of this court, we can adjust that amount in the future. I advise you to instruct your legal representatives to verify any assets Mrs. Thomas may have in the UK. The courtroom was silent as the judge's words settled. I felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. The support from Carol, Frank, and Endora, especially Meliora, had given me the strength to navigate through these turbulent times. The judge's decision brought a sense of closure, yet the battle was far from over. Despite the uncertainty ahead, I felt a renewed determination to face whatever came next, knowing I had the backing of those who truly cared for me and Meliora. That was it. I walked out of court a single man, gaining all the property acquired during the marriage, and apparently any other property that Alethea had in the country, if I wished, if we could find it. I never bothered to look for it. Checking the call log at home the following Monday, I noticed there had been an international call the day before. Probably while I was mowing the lawn, which would explain why I hadn't heard the phone ringing. The call had obviously come from Alethea. She was the only person who had ever called from abroad. Strangely, neither Meliora nor Brian mentioned the call to me, nor did they inform me of Alethea's whereabouts as usual. You can assume they didn't, but I know I figured it out. Since Meliora wasn't in court that week, I tried not to give much thought to her mother's whereabouts. I wondered how the girls knew about the 21 days the judge had given Alethea. I doubted that the court-appointed social worker would have told her. As time went on, Alethea's calls to Meliora became more infrequent. I wasn't surprised, because from the few calls I overheard, I realized they were very one-sided. Not counting my daughter's subtle inquiries about Alethea's location, those too ceased once her fancy man's divorce was settled. By the way, I have no idea how Meliora or Brian found out about his divorce being settled. I concluded that since he was local, his kids probably went to the same school as the girls. Perhaps the kids all conspired and shared information. But if that was the case, the girls didn't tell me anything. I suppose the same reasoning could be used to explain the information the girls originally had about Alethea's plans when she first made her statement and moved out. Adults too easily underestimate children's understanding of exactly what is going on. I can't remember now, but I think the divorce was finalized about 4 months ago. I took Meliora and Brian to a movie one Saturday afternoon. We were enjoying hamburgers at the local McDonald's when Brian announced that she and her mother would be moving home soon. I innocently inquired as to the reason, of course, and Brian informed me that the lease on their apartment was up for renewal, but her mother thought the landlord wanted to raise the rent too much. No, at the time I didn't see or realize what was going on, and that another conspiracy was afoot. Come on, they were 2 9-year-old kids, and tricking me out of an ice cream or convincing me to stay up late was one thing, but orchestrating a move back home, that seemed beyond them. Yet, looking back, I see how much I underestimated their cunning and understanding of the situation. As I reflected on these moments, I realized that despite the tumultuous events, the girls had a resilience and maturity that often surprised me. They navigated their world with a mix of innocence and shrewdness that sometimes left me in awe. They managed to maintain a semblance of normalcy and joy amidst the chaos, and for that, I was grateful. 2 kids tricking me out of an ice cream or convincing me to stay up late was one thing, but planning to trick me into inviting Endora and Brian to move in with Meliora and me? That was something I hadn't even realized they were capable of. The trap was set on a Friday night when we all ate dinner together, a delicious meal prepared by Endora before she left for her shift at the cab office. Meliora, with a seemingly innocent expression, asked Endora if she had found a suitable apartment yet. Before Endora could answer, Brian began telling horror stories about the places they'd seen. Although Endora managed to point out that they weren't nearly as bad as Brian described, the seed of concern was already planted. For some reason, I had completely overlooked the fact that if Brian had seen those apartments, Meliora had too. Those 2 girls were always together, regardless of whether it was Endora or me looking after them. Meliora then made a suggestion that, had I been more skeptical, I should have seen coming a mile away. "Yeah, Endora, we have a spare guest room upstairs," remarked Meliora. "Why don't Brian and Aunt Endora move in with us? Brian has her own bed in my room anyway, and it would save us from having to move from house to house all the time. I have to admit, I thought Meliora's idea was a good one. It would save me from having to chase around town and Andorra from having to pay rent, among other things. I looked at Andorra for a clue, but she avoided meeting my gaze. I found myself in an awkward situation. If I rejected the offer right away, Andorra might resent it. But on the other hand, she might not like the idea, and I might embarrass her if I put the ball in her court. I decided that the safest way out was to muddy the waters a bit. Well, honey, you see, sometimes there can be problems when a man and a woman who aren't married live in the same house. You know, some people might get the wrong idea, I stuttered. Surprisingly, Andorra giggled. Geez, Pete, you sound like a real prude. No, Andorra. I was just thinking of your reputation, I said, trying to sound considerate. My reputation? You've got to be kidding me. Do you want to know the real reason we're being forced out of our apartment? It's because I disappear every week on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday nights. What's more, I used to get a cab home in the mornings, but now I drive a brand new car. I don't understand. The Nissan isn't new, I replied, confused, and Dora laughed again, a bit more heartily this time. Exactly, Pete. The neighbors think I'm up to no good because they see me coming and going at odd hours in a car they assume is brand new. They think I'm some kind of high-class escort or something. Her candid explanation took me by surprise, and I found myself laughing along with her. Well, that certainly clears things up, I said, still chuckling. So, what do you say? Should we give it a try? She asked, her tone becoming more serious. I took a deep breath and looked around at the three expectant faces. All right, let's give it a shot, but let's make sure we set some ground rules to keep everything clear and respectful. Andorra and the girls smiled, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. This unexpected turn of events might just be the start of a new, happier chapter for all of us. Yes, next to my neighbors' cars. Some of them are sure I could only afford a car like that if I had a certain night job. Andorra sat and waited for me to digest what she'd said with a token expression on her face. You're kidding me, I gasped. No, I don't work. They wrote to my landlord. I told all of them that I work at a cab company, and I even talked to some of them when they called a cab, but the rumors don't stop. My God, the sooner you get out of there, the better. That's what I thought, but finding another decent apartment I could afford isn't as easy as it seems. What about Meliora's idea, since there's plenty of room? Are you sure? I asked, trying to hide my enthusiasm. Yeah, I bet you are. Without the girls, this place is like a morgue, and besides, you're not half as bad a cook as I am. Should I take that as a compliment? As for my cooking, yes. The room is over there if you want it, Andorra, and from the look on those two faces, they can't wait. I pointed to the two grinning faces of the children. We'll have to discuss the lease, suggested Andorra. No, I don't think we will. Housekeeping isn't among my favorite things to do, and I've already told you that you're a better cook than I am. Maybe you'll become something of a home cook around here? Pete, I'd do it anyway, but I'd have to pay you something, at least for heating, electricity, and housekeeping tax, insisted Andorra. Let's save that for later. Right now, I have to ask you if you're sure you want to move here. If you're inviting us, then yes, we'd love to. Then let's assume the deal is done. When do you want to move in? How about this weekend, she replied. Well, this apartment is furnished. Don't worry, most of my things aren't worth worrying about. A lot of them can be thrown away. I sold all the good stuff years ago, right after Tony left when I was short of money. What happened? I asked, sensing there was more to the story. But I knew from the look in Andorra's eyes that she would tell me when the kids weren't around. As we continued to talk, it became clear that this move would be a fresh start for all of us. Andorra and Brian would bring a new energy to the house, and the girls were already ecstatic about the idea. The thought of our two families merging into one household brought a sense of hope and excitement I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the beginning of a new chapter, and I was ready to embrace it. I'd been married to Alethea long enough to recognize that expression. I was aware that Andorra's husband had been killed in a traffic accident a few years ago, but I never knew the details. A little while later, when we went to walk Andorra to the Nissan, I heard a distinct smacking sound behind me and turned around to see what it was. I found Meliora and Brian standing there, looking at me with butter wouldn't melt in your mouth expressions on their faces. The girls moved into the house the following week. Most of Andora's furniture had been thrown away, but some things still made their way into the house. Other items were stored in the garage, and her television and music center ended up in the girls' bedroom. The house was suddenly a full-fledged home again. Even the guys at work remarked on my improved mood. There were also comments about me not joining them for drinks after work as often. But I had a daughter, well, 2 daughters, to bring home and read bedtime stories to every night. Yeah, my traveling days were practically over when Marge left. Not knowing how events would unfold, I tempered my fervor a bit. My boss relented and started sending other guys in my place. I just didn't volunteer to go anymore, if I could help it. Shortly after moving Andorra in, I began to fall in love with this woman. Although at the time I thought I was very good at not showing it. What did you expect? Andorra was a pretty dainty piece of real estate by any standards. Maybe a year or so younger than me, she seemed to present herself immaculately, regardless of what she was or wasn't wearing. Sure, I'd seen her pass between the guest room and the bathroom a few times, wrapped only in a bath sheet, but that was it. Andorra had a killer sense of humor and never seemed to resent the girls or me, no matter what the little pranksters did. She apparently paid no attention to my, idiosyncrasies. Look, I never claimed I wouldn't be a bloodthirsty angel to live with. I was in love with Andorra from the first time I laid eyes on her, so it was to be expected. I think Carol was the first to realize I was hooked that Christmas. She and Frank had brought their family over for Boxing Day. Andorra was fussing over the dinner she was making. "Have you told her yet?" asked Carol as we set the table together in the dining room. "To whom and what did you say?" I replied, genuinely confused. "Of course, Andorra, brother," Carol said, rolling her eyes. "I'm sorry, kid, you lost me. What was I supposed to tell her?" I asked, still bewildered. Carol sighed and gave me a knowing look. "That you love her, Pete. It's written all over your face. Everyone but you seems to know it." I stopped and stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. It was true, my feelings for Andorra had grown deeper with each passing day. But admitting it, especially to her, was a step I hadn't been brave enough to take. As the evening wore on, I found myself watching Andorra, admiring the way she moved effortlessly around the kitchen, the way she laughed with the kids, and the warmth she brought to the house. Carol was right. It was time to tell Andorra how I felt. The question was, how? "That you're in love with her, you fool," announced Carol. "Do what?" I stammered. "Don't be silly, Carol. Come on, Pete. I'm reading you like a book. You're even more hooked on Andorra than you were on Stephanie Mathers." I'd better explain Stephanie Mathers. She was my first love back when we were all in high school together. Carol's friend, and I worshipped the ground this girl walked on for several years before I got up the courage to ask her out. She led me on for a while, and then broke my heart by leaving me for someone else. Stephanie was immediately and irrevocably declared persona non grata by my sister and her friends. Some of them comforted me over the following months. God, they made sure I forgot about Stephanie as soon as possible. Of course I've grown attached to her. She's a very nice person, Carol, but I'm in a delicate situation. The status quo suits us both. If I do anything to upset the balance, my God, I could smash the apple cart. Peter, this woman has a crush on you as much as you have on her. You dance around each other like school kids in love. What the hell are you talking about, Carol? Pete, to get from one end of the room to the other, you both take the long way around, so there's no chance of you, heaven forbid, touching each other. So we don't want to invade each other's personal space. Big deal. Nonsense. There are only 2 reasons why 2 people living in the same house would do such a thing. Either you hate each other, which I somehow doubt because no one has ever heard a single crossword between you, or you're in love with each other. And don't try to bullshit me. You've never once exchanged a thought-provoking joke. That's unusual for 2 people who spend so much time in close proximity to each other. Think of all the jokes you exchange with the girls in the office. No, you're both too afraid of ruining what you have. So you think Andorra is partial to me? My God, Pete, she's dancing the same dance you are. You both move to the same tune. Even the girls can see that. So what am I supposed to do? The hell of it, Peter. Tell her how you feel, I guess. Carol's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. My heart raced at the thought of confessing my feelings to Andorra. As the evening went on, I found myself watching her more intently, admiring her grace and the effortless way she moved around the kitchen, her laughter filling the house with warmth. That night, as we sat down to dinner, I could hardly focus on the conversation. My mind was racing, rehearsing how I might tell Andorra how I felt. I looked around the table at the smiling faces of Meliora and Brian, who were already so happy in our little blended family. I knew I had to take the chance, for all our sakes. After dinner, while Andorra was tidying up in the kitchen, I took a deep breath and walked over to her. My hands were trembling slightly as I took hers in mine. Andorra, there's something I need to tell you, I began, my voice shaky but determined. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with curiosity and perhaps a bit of hope. I've fallen in love with you. I know this might complicate things, but I can't keep it to myself any longer. I need you to know how I feel. Andorra's face softened, and she squeezed my hands gently. Pete, I've fallen in love with you too. I've been too scared to say anything, afraid it would ruin what we have. But now, hearing you say it, I feel such relief. We stood there, holding each other's hands, realizing that this was the beginning of a new chapter for both of us. The fear of the unknown melted away, replaced by the promise of a shared future, filled with love and happiness. Come on, she's not the first woman you've called on to work your golden tongue, Carol teased. You knew how to get girls until you got involved with that bitch. You never liked Alethea, did you? I asked, somewhat defensively. No, I never trusted her. It seemed to me that she had you wrapped around her finger and then led you around by the nose. About the same way Meliora and Brian are doing it now, but I doubt you'll ever see it. The difference is that those two little girls really love you, which I never thought Alethea did. You are mistaken, Carol. Of course, Alethea loved me when we were married. Think what you want, Pete. You've seen love. I've seen a girl who got off easy. You had a hell of a job for a young man your age, and you actually brought home the bacon. Christ, Frank wasn't getting half your paycheck when I married him. I was always convinced that Alethea only saw you as a pound sign. No, you're wrong, Carol. Never mind, it doesn't matter now, does it? Peter, someone has given you a second chance at happiness. There's a woman in the kitchen who I'm sure is in love with you. You'll just have to find a way to melt the ice. No sooner had the conversation gone any farther than we heard Andorra approaching. She entered the dining room to see how the meal preparations were going, and Carol and I had to change the subject. During the meal, Carol kept catching my eye and making subtle head gestures toward Andorra. She also seemed to be enjoying a private joke with Meliora and Brian, but I don't think anyone else noticed it. Over the next few days, I almost broached the subject of Andorra several times, but chickened out at the last minute. It was New Year's Eve, and Andorra was working. Carol and Frank picked up the girls so I could go to a party with some friends from the office. I didn't want to leave the girls, but everyone insisted. Conspiracy again? I don't think so. Too many unconnected people. What happened that night must have been a coincidence. It was about 4 a.m, and the party was winding down. Those who were going home had already left, and most of the others had gone their separate ways. I found myself standing on the balcony, staring out at the city lights, lost in thought. The crisp night air was refreshing, and I took a deep breath, trying to clear my mind. Suddenly, I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder. I turned around to see Andorra standing there, her eyes soft and understanding. Mind if I join you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Of course not, I replied, surprised but pleased to see her. I finished my shift early and thought I'd come by, she explained, stepping closer to the railing. We stood there in silence for a few moments, the city below us buzzing with the remnants of New Year's celebrations. Finally, I mustered the courage to speak. Andorra, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. She looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the twinkling lights. What is it, Pete? I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. I've fallen in love with you. I know it might complicate things, but I can't keep it to myself any longer. Andorra's face softened, and she smiled gently. Pete, I've fallen in love with you too. I've been afraid to say anything, worried it would change what we have. Relief washed over me, and I reached out to take her hand. "I'm so glad to hear that," I said, my voice filled with emotion. "I don't want to keep dancing around each other. I want to build something real with you." Andorra nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Me too, Pete. Let's take this step together." As we embraced under the starlit sky, I felt a sense of completeness I hadn't known in years. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Andorra by my side, I knew we could face anything. This was our new beginning, and I was ready to embrace it with all my heart. Unable to find a single comfortable vacant place to spend the night, and having drunk too much to even think about driving home, unless I wanted to make sure I didn't get there in one piece, I hailed a cab. "Hey, gorgeous, why don't you send one of the guys to take me home?" Maybe not exactly the words I'd used, but pretty much what I'd said to Andorra when she answered the call at the cab service. "Are you mad, Pete?" asked Andorra. "You bet, babe. I had a hard time deciding which of those two phones to call. I'll bring one of the boys over in 5 minutes." "Thank you, sweetheart. And Pete, yes, beautiful. Try not to throw up all over the back seat." Have you ever seen me throw up when I'm furious? I've never seen you drunk, Peter. I can't imagine what you do. Would you be surprised? You bet. Now Phil's hitting the road, and please don't make a mess in his car. We have enough guys trying to get the smell of vomit out of their cars as it is. Your word is my command, my love, if that's all you meant. What? Never mind. Phil's already out the door. Why don't you try to find your way to his car? Said Andorra, laughing. Then the line cut off. Jesus, Pete, you're bleeding out of your skin, said driver Phil, who obviously knew who I was, even if I didn't know him, as he helped me into the back seat of his cab. But when he got behind the wheel, even in my inebriated state, I realized he wasn't headed for my house. You're going the wrong way, I told him, or more accurately, sassed him. You're going to need someone to put you to bed, and I don't intend to do the honor. I think I know who will volunteer. It's pretty quiet around here now. One of the guys can sit on the phones for the rest of the night. Honestly, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, Phil and Andorra were dragging me from the back seat of the car. Maybe I did act a little helpless, especially when Andorra clung to my arm to help me to the door and through it. I needed Phil's help to successfully navigate the stairs to the bedroom, though. As they got me into the room, Andorra's touch was gentle but firm, guiding me with care. Come on, Pete, you're almost there, she whispered, her voice a soothing balm in my alcohol-addled haze. Thanks, Andorra, I mumbled, feeling a surge of gratitude amidst the fog. No problem. Let's get you into bed, she said softly. Phil, meanwhile, steadied me from the other side, ensuring I didn't take a tumble. Once we reached the bedroom, Andorra helped me sit on the edge of the bed. Phil, I can take it from here. Thanks for your help. Anytime, Phil replied, giving me a pat on the back. Take care, Pete. He left quietly, closing the door behind him. Andorra knelt down to remove my shoes, her movements efficient and caring. You're a mess. You know that? She teased lightly. I chuckled weakly. Yeah, I guess I am. Sorry for the trouble. You're no trouble, she replied, her tone sincere. Now lie down and get some rest. As I settled back into the pillows, I felt Andorra pull a blanket over me. Good night, Pete, she said, her voice soft and tender. Good night, Andorra, I murmured, my eyes closing as I drifted off. Her presence was the last thing I remembered before sleep claimed me, and it brought a comforting warmth that lingered even in my dreams. As soon as Phil was gone, I started playing possum again, and Andorra began loosening my clothes, trying to make me comfortable. You know that you can do some stupid things while intoxicated. Because of your lowered level of restraint, you can get away with things you would never dare to say when sober. For me, it was the perfect opportunity to try my luck. But perhaps the booze didn't help me choose the best words. Suddenly, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Andorra was leaning over me, staring straight into my eyes from very close up. You know, you're one hell of an attractive little Andorra, I muttered. And what does that mean? She asked, her eyebrows raised. That you're good enough to eat and I'm hungry, I slurred, probably with a drunken smirk on my face. Yes, really? Well, I suspect that if you ate anything, you wouldn't be able to keep it down for long. How much have you had to drink today? Not enough. Jesus, Pete, you're as mean as a newt. Yeah, but if I drank a little more, I'd have the courage to tell you how much I love you. A wide smile appeared on Andora's face. I'll believe it when you can tell me sober. Now get some sleep, and we'll see how bad your head is in the morning. Good night, Peter, she added, then rose to leave the room. No, you can't leave, I insisted. I might get sick, and I might suffocate. Well, where am I supposed to sleep then? I grabbed Andora's arm as she stood and pulled her gently so that she fell onto the bed beside me. She didn't try to get up. Nothing more was said, and eventually I must have dozed off. Well, probably pretty quickly, since I had so much booze in me. And Dora was right. The daylight pouring in through the bedroom windows was not helping my condition, and I was somewhat disappointed to find that she was no longer in the bed beside me. I wanted to lift my head off the pillow and suddenly realized that wasn't a good idea. I must have groaned in pain. Here, have a drink, I heard Andora's voice from behind me. What is it? I asked, shielding my eyes from the sunlight as I rolled over to look in her direction. Well, it can't be poison until you marry me, right? I need to make sure I can get insurance on your life before I blow you off. How do you know I won't turn the tables and bump you off first? I replied, trying to smile through the pounding headache. And Dora laughed, a sound that somehow made my head hurt less. Let's see you survive this hangover first, tough guy. Then we can talk about murder plots. She handed me a glass of water and some painkillers. Drink up, it'll help. I took the glass gratefully, managing a weak smile. Thanks, Andora. And about last night, I'm sorry if I said anything stupid. You said a lot of things, Pete, she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. But we'll talk about it when you're sober. Now, rest. You've got a long recovery ahead. As she left the room, I couldn't help but feel a mix of embarrassment and relief. Last night had been a mess, but maybe, just maybe, it had also been the start of something new. I closed my eyes, the painkillers starting to take effect, and drifted back into a more peaceful sleep, dreaming of a future that might just be possible. If Andora wants to play comedian, I figured I'd try to be witty too. No, you can't do that. You have 2 daughters you need someone to look after. One of them is yours. They don't see it that way, Peter. They like to think of themselves as sisters, and they both think of you as their father. What about you, I asked, curious. I think I'm considered Meliora's mother now, too. Haven't you noticed that Aunt Andora has stopped being a mom lately? She's called me mom several times in the last week. Yeah, I hadn't noticed. I know, and you didn't give a hoot when Brian started calling you daddy a few weeks ago. I'm not very observant, am I? Did she really call me her father? Daddy, to be exact, Peter. She's been calling you daddy for about a month now. Even Carol and Frank have noticed it. And you discussed it with Carol on Boxing Day. I discussed a lot of things with Carol on Boxing Day, Peter. That explains it then. What? Why she's already planning her wedding outfit? I replied with as much of a smile as possible, considering I had this little guy with Thor's hammer running around in my head. And Dora sat looking at me, still holding the potion she had prepared for me in her hand. Well? I asked after she apparently hadn't responded in ages. And Dora sat with a confused expression on her face. I expected her to ask a question in response to my comment, but it didn't come as I'd hoped. And what is it? She replied. So, are you going to marry me or not? You didn't ask me to do that. I know I'm a coward. I was trying to get an answer from you before I asked. It's much better not to look like a prize prune when I get rejected. Well, we'll see. I guess you wouldn't look like a fruitcake if you asked, Andora replied. But, I prompted, sensing there was more, I have a confession to make to you before you commit to it. Sounds serious. Should I be worried? Andora sighed, setting the potion down on the bedside table and taking a seat next to me. She took a deep breath before looking me straight in the eyes. Peter, there's something you need to know about Tony, my late husband. He didn't just die in a traffic accident. He was running away from something, from debt collectors. He had a gambling problem, and he left us in a lot of debt. I've been working so hard to pay it off and keep Brian safe from those people. That's why I can't afford my own place. I was taken aback, processing the gravity of what she had just revealed. Andora, why didn't you tell me sooner? I didn't want to burden you. You've done so much for us already. I was scared you might think less of me. Andora, I said, taking her hands in mine, Nothing you say could make me think less of you. If anything, I admire you more for what you've gone through and how strong you've been for Brian. We're a team now. We'll face this together." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she smiled through them. "So, does this mean you still want to marry me?" I leaned in and kissed her gently. "More than ever, we'll get through this, Endora. Together." As we embraced, I felt a profound sense of relief and anticipation. The challenges ahead seemed less daunting with Endora by my side. This was our new beginning, and I was ready to face it head-on with the woman I loved and our 2 wonderful daughters. "No, but it is. I'm not a widow, Peter. Tony's not dead. In fact, legally, I was never married to him. Or rather, I was married, but I wasn't. I think I'm losing something in translation, Endora. Tony was a bigamist, Pete. He was already married when he married me, so legally my marriage to him is null and void." "Oops, can you say that?" Tony actually married 3 of us at different times, and he fled the country during the trial. That's why I told Brian he's dead. If he's ever tracked down, he'll be in jail for years. Not that I think they'll do that. The bastard has probably already tricked some other stupid cow into marrying him. "So you're not a widow, and you've never been married," I said. "No, technically I'm an unmarried mother. It's just a lot less complicated to tell everyone I'm a widow." "In that case, would you do me the honor of—" I never got around to asking the rest of the question, and Endora never got around to answering it. I'm not even sure where the damn drink she brought me went. But we spent the next hour or so rolling around on the bed and the floor like a couple of teenagers, my headache almost forgotten. No, it wasn't. We just kissed and hugged and whispered silly sweet nothings to each other. It was fun, although my head was still acting up. With a head like that, I don't think I could have performed. By the time Frank brought the girls home, it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Endora and I were sitting in the kitchen, making plans and thinking about how to break the news to the girls. But we didn't have to say anything to them. The little rascals seemed to get it right away. Maybe it was because Endora was almost sitting on my lap when they came through the door. In any case, they stopped where they were, looked at us for a few seconds, then greeted each other again, and then went around the table and hugged us both. I think we both thought we had flashing neon signs on our heads when Frank, upon entering the kitchen, did a quick double take and simply said, "Congratulations. When?" Which Endora and I translated as, "What date have we set for the wedding?" This necessitated further discussion, which involved Carol, whom Frank had telephoned. Eventually, a date was set, rather arbitrarily, for mid-February. Endora and I wanted a modest celebration, while our girls wanted something more extravagant. I think we settled on something average. We decided to have the wedding itself at the registry office, and afterwards to have a rather lavish but small reception. Neither Endora nor I had many living relatives afterwards. The registry office was chosen because, well, there were no announcements to read and no entries in the parish newspaper to worry about. Announcements like "Maiden of this parish" and "in the presence of her daughter" might have confused some people. Endora was supposed to be a widow. After Frank went home, Endora had the delicate task of giving her application to the supervisor at the taxi cab company. My wife wouldn't work the night shift for anything in the world, for reasons too numerous to mention, and personal pride or distrust are not part of the equation. It's more of a personal preference. It pissed me off to sleep, or rather not sleep, alone. Endora and I had another big decision to make when it was time for us to go to bed that night. In the end, we decided to go to separate bedrooms until the wedding. We both realized that it would be hard for us to justify any of our positions on extramarital sex to the girls when they got older if they saw us sharing a room before the wedding. But that doesn't mean I didn't develop the habit of running home for lunch on most days as soon as the girls got back to school. Okay, I took a few long lunches, but no one in the office minded, most likely because of the further improvement in my overall mood. The following weekend, Endora worked her last shifts at the taxi depot. It took several cabs to take all the flowers and boxes of chocolates home on Sunday morning. Then we had to limit the girls for a few weeks. It wasn't Sunday night in Endora. Some of the drivers and their wives invited us to dinner and some fun at a local pub. Cabs were in short supply in town that evening. The wedding came almost before we realized it. It went very well, considering our girls were flawless bridesmaids. The ceremony was intimate and beautiful, and our little reception was filled with laughter, joy, and the kind of warmth that made everything feel just right. And Dora and I looked at each other, knowing that we had overcome so much to be together. And now, surrounded by the people we loved, we were finally starting our new life as a family. I think Andorra and Carol spent more time making the girls look perfect than my bride. But as I think I've said before, Andorra can look good in just about anything. Andorra and I didn't have a honeymoon per se. We spent one night in the honeymoon suite at the luxury hotel where we held the reception. The girls went home for the night with Frank and Carol's family. Our master plan was to get away with the girls for most of the school summer vacation that year. That first year, we spent 5 weeks driving around Florida, the Caribbean, and Southern California. Never staying anywhere for more than a few days, we saw just about everything we could see and experience in the allotted time. It was only a week or two after the wedding, and when I got home from work one evening, I immediately realized that something was wrong. The girls looked quite happy, but Andorra was annoyed about something. It wasn't until the girls went to bed that she told me what was bothering her. "Does Brian know that Tony isn't dead?" she asked as soon as I came downstairs after putting both girls to bed and reading them each a chapter from their book. "Jesus, how did she know?" I asked in surprise. I was pretty sure we'd never discussed it while the girls were in the house. "I have no idea, though I've suspected something was wrong ever since we moved here. Remember those pictures by the girls' beds? The beds in the girls' room are parallel to each other. There were 3 small closets, one on each side and a third in the middle. On the center one hung 2 pictures of Andorra and me. On the outer ones were pictures of Alithea and Tony, respectively. Andorra explained that lately she had found that the girls often put pictures of Alithea and Tony in the drawers. It suddenly dawned on me that I hadn't seen either picture that evening. Finally, Andorra asked the girls why they were hiding the pictures. Brian replied, "They don't need us. We don't want to look at their pictures." Further discussion proved to Andorra that Brian knew full well that her father had not died in a traffic accident but had run away, although she did not seem to know why. Out of embarrassment, Andorra decided to leave Brian in the dark. She didn't want to explain to the child that she was technically an illegitimate child. Although Andorra had been worried for some time about Brian's reaction to the information that her father was out there, the child didn't seem to mind. Personally, I thought the information helped the girls feel closer to each other. Andorra turned out to be the perfect wife. Even better than the perfect wife, she was an amazing mother to both of our girls. Not only was she great with the kids, but she was extremely patient with me when things got hectic at the office. Yes, no matter what Meliora claims, I do have flaws, but Andorra seems to overlook them, never once mentioning them. She has the most wonderful sense of humor and has come up with many ways to wind me up in the evening and tease me until the kids go to bed, or we do. Sometimes my nights can be very tiring. By early summer, the number of phone calls from Alithea to Meliora had virtually dropped to 0. I'm not surprised that Meliora changed course, went on the offensive, and became very persistent when Alithea did call. I know she was mad at her mother, but both Andorra and I had to step in and reprimand Meliora for referring to Andorra as new mommy in her conversations with Alithea. Meliora discarded this trick and instead went on about how much fun we had as a family going out, regularly mentioning Daddy's wife and my sister Brian. Andorra and I have had several discussions about Meliora's attitude toward Alithea and how she talks to her on the phone. But in the end, we concluded that it was impossible to create an endless list of words and phrases that Meliora was forbidden to use toward her. Meliora, with Brian's connivance, is bound to come up with new ones, no matter what we forbid. We decided that Alithea had made her own bed that day in the kitchen. Now she would have to get used to lying in it. Before we could get back from vacation, Meliora and Brian started talking about Mom and Dad again. Andorra and I had a hard time understanding what they were implying for a while, but then we realized they were asking if we were really their mom and dad. I blamed the internet. Suddenly, Andorra and I began finding printouts all over the house regarding adoption procedures with, we assumed, the intention of encouraging Andorra to adopt Meliora and me to adopt Brian. The girls also researched the legal intricacies of changing Brian's name to Thomas and even printed out the appropriate forms. As for the idea of adoption, after some discussion, Andorra and I decided that it had to be either one or both. Brian's father, although he had abandoned her and Andorra, still retained his legal rights over her. We ended up putting the problem in the hands of the same attorney who handled my divorce. It took over a year, but eventually we were able to get Tony's parental rights terminated, and both adoptions took place. Coincidentally, or by our lawyer's intent, the same judge who presided over my divorce case was presiding over Tony's termination of parental rights. By the time all the legalities were sorted, our family felt more complete than ever. The girls beamed with joy at their newfound official status as sisters, and Andorra and I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Life was hectic and full of love, exactly how we wanted it to be. I strongly suspect that might have had something to do with his decision. Legally, our family now consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas and our daughters Meliora and Brian. We discussed adding to the family, but in the end, we decided not to, which was what we had intended. Shortly after we were married, I got a promotion at work, and with the promotion came a bigger salary and the ability to delegate more responsibilities. Our summer trips became regular, and I really think Andorra planned them as a kind of compensation for my lack of time to travel when I was younger. In our second year of marriage, we spent 5 weeks traveling around Europe. In the third, we visited India, a surprisingly large country, and Sri Lanka. In the fourth, we visited Australia and New Zealand, and yes, we miscalculated by going there in the middle of their winter. But we're British. It was hard for us to notice the difference. By the time our fifth summer came around, we knew a lot about traveling. Meliora and Brian, both 14 years old by then, had their own video cameras, and they were already doing a good job of documenting our travels. Canada, the northern US, and Alaska were all planned for that year, and for most of the winter and spring, all three of my girls made detailed plans. By then, I had left them to their own devices, only occasionally mentioning the name of some unusual place I had heard of years ago, and knowing that we would stop there sometime during the trip. But there was one thing I don't think either of us considered. About 2 years after we were married, Andorra and I started getting Christmas cards from Alethea. Meliora always got Christmas and birthday cards from her, but we had no idea why she suddenly decided to send Christmas cards to us. We couldn't reciprocate because none of the cards had a return address. However, the thing is, and I suppose the rest of the family didn't pay attention to this, they all had Canadian stamps. This would lead anyone who thought about it to think that Alethea and Ronald had settled somewhere in this country. Unfortunately, Alethea was rarely mentioned in our house anymore, and I don't think she called Meliora on the phone for several years, so no one brought it up. As always, the master plan for our extended summer vacation that year changed along the way. When the girls informed me that we had no chance of visiting all the places we wanted to in the allotted time, and this after we had made some very strong cuts to the list. In the end, we decided to draw an arbitrary line across the continent, just as we had drawn a line across it a few years earlier. We would visit the West that summer and leave the East for another year. We arrived in Winnipeg on an Air Canada flight in late June, and after spending a day or two exploring the historic sites around the city, this is not a travel log, so I won't go into detail, we took a tour in a rental car. From Manitoba, we traveled west to Saskatchewan, then turned south and almost back through the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas, before turning west and then north again, driving through Colorado and Wyoming, where we spent a few days at what is known as a dude ranch. The horses were pleasant to ride, but I think I'll stick to English saddles in the future. As comfortable as the Western-type saddles were, I got the feeling that it wouldn't be so easy to get out of them if something went wrong. However, I didn't have the slightest confidence that it would happen. The rain on my neck was an interesting experience too. There are two theories about riding horses or motorcycles when they get hit by wheels. Stay with it and hope you manage to regain control, or back off and hope you fall to the ground. Get to your feet and run. The prospect of being on a horse or motorcycle with a squealing engine and spinning rear wheel landing on me has never been my idea of a good time. Eventually, we entered Montana and stopped in a town I'd heard about somewhere and had always wanted to visit. I must have read about this place in some western. After checking into a hotel, motel, or whatever you want to call it, we headed to a restaurant, I guess a diner we had seen nearby. The restaurant was crowded and a little noisy. All the customers were chatting with each other, but suddenly there was a great rumble followed by absolute silence. Everyone fell silent, as is always the case in such situations. One of the waitresses dropped a tray of food. It's one of those reflex actions that you can't control, isn't it? And Dora and I, like everyone else in the place, started looking to see who exactly had so clumsily prevented us from eating by dropping the tray. A rather rash act, because surely the culprit would have been embarrassed enough without the fuss. She certainly didn't want to be stared at by every passerby in the place. I quickly located the culprit and, to my surprise, recognized her. What's more, it was obvious that she'd noticed me too. On reflection, I realized that it was probably her recognition that had caused her to drop the damn tray. The poor woman was standing there with her mouth open and her eyes wide, staring straight at me. "Alethea?" I muttered, barely believing my eyes. I could tell from Andora's reaction that she too recognized the woman. Anyway, both Andora and I had to react by saying almost the same thing in unison to our girls. "Eat your dinner, Brian. Meliora, you have nothing to worry about." Andora turned to Brian and I turned to Meliora. Although they were now our girls, we had both legally adopted each other's daughters. Even after 5 years, we still had a tendency to address our own child first. Not that it mattered. Both kids were twisting in their seats, trying to get a glimpse of the culprit of the commotion. Recognizing the woman, Meliora turned around almost instantly and, I believe, uttered the words, "So be it," under her breath, then returned to her meal as if nothing had happened. Brian stared for a moment longer before the waitress turned and left the public area of the restaurant. Then she looked at me, smiled sweetly, then shifted her gaze to her mother's eyes before returning to her food, just as Meliora had. After the waitress left, many customers looked in our direction. Some may have looked in our direction before the waitress left, but I didn't notice. Anyway, they all realized that the incident was caused by our presence. And Dora, the girls, and I tried to ignore the stares and continued our meal as best we could. "I guess the grass wasn't as green as it looked," and Dora whispered to me as we followed the two girls running to the car. "What do you mean?" I replied, perhaps a little more curtly than I intended. "I think it's safe to assume she's no longer with Ronald if she's working here. Most likely one of them cheated on the other." "They say once you cheat, you always cheat," I replied. "But she didn't cheat on you. That stupid bitch just dumped you and Meliora. You're not trying to trick me into thinking they didn't consummate their relationship before the divorce. Besides, in my opinion, leaving your daughter is tantamount to cheating. You can be sure that either she couldn't keep her legs crossed or he couldn't keep it in his pants. Does it matter? Not if she doesn't try to cause trouble here and now. Meliora was confused enough as it was. There's no need to put her through more turmoil. It's too late for her to try something like that, Pete. Besides, I think Meliora handled it a lot better than you did. After all, it was the girls who— Don't say that, Andora. I know exactly what those little ones did, and I'm glad we have a couple of manipulative little minxes, though sometimes I have to wonder how far their manipulations go." "What do you mean?" "No big deal, but it was obvious they were working to a plan. Sometimes I wonder how far in advance they laid everything out. Don't worry, I couldn't be more pleased than I am now. I just get curious sometimes." By this time, we had gotten to the car. I unlocked the doors with the remote as we pulled up, and the kids jumped into the back seats. I opened the front door and held it open for Andora, but she didn't get in. She came right up to me, wrapped her arms around my neck, and kissed me. The two little devils sitting in the back of the car murmured and shouted approvingly. This was followed by comments like, "Not in public," and "Would you two please wait until you get to your room?" One might think that these were rather disrespectful and cavalier comments coming from two 14-year-olds, but both of our daughters were very mature for their age. My goodness, how quickly they had to grow up. Andorra had lost her husband when Brian was 6 and had lived alone for many years. Meliora saw her mother leave us and almost publicly disown her when she was 8 years old. I assure you, I didn't handle that event too well, but my daughter, with Brian's help, began to behave like a much more mature person. Very suddenly, Andorra interrupted the kiss and pulled back slightly. "We have an audience," she whispered, peering over my shoulder. I looked back and saw Alethea standing in the kitchen doorway watching us. "Do you think Meliora should?" suggested Andorra. "Yeah, I don't think we have a choice," I replied. I was well aware that I would have to go back later to talk to Alethea, or rather confront her, and that would likely lead to us arranging for Meliora to meet with her mother alone. Frankly, it was too good an opportunity to pass up. We'd have gotten that side of things out of the way anyway. Andorra, leaning against the car, spoke while I was still pondering. "Your mom is there. I think you should go see her." "Do I have to?" replied Meliora. "She is your mother, Meliora. Now please do what we ask you to do, or else, many years from now, when you are older, you will be sorry you missed this opportunity." Meliora shrugged and started to climb out of the car. She paused for a moment, looked back at Brian, and then at Andorra and me. "Okay, I'll do it, but if she tries to cause trouble, I'm coming straight back." "That's fair," I said, feeling a mixture of pride and concern. Meliora walked slowly toward the restaurant, her posture resolute but cautious. As she disappeared through the door, I turned back to Andorra, who was watching her intently. "We're doing the right thing, aren't we?" Andorra asked softly, leaning her head against my shoulder. "Yes, we are. She needs to confront her mother, and Alethea needs to understand the consequences of her actions." We stood there in silence, holding each other, waiting for Meliora to return. "I don't want to see her. Maybe Brian will ride with me?" "No, we're just here. We won't be missing from your sight," assured Andorra. After getting out of the car, Meliora, with noticeable reluctance and a few dejected glances back at us, made her way toward her mother, stopping 10 feet away from her. Alethea apparently said something we couldn't hear and took a step toward her, but Meliora immediately took a step back. It was a little frustrating that we couldn't hear what they were saying to each other, although I think Meliora did talk a lot. We noticed that if Alethea moved any closer to Meliora, the child would retreat. "That's not good," muttered Andorra, apparently so Brian wouldn't hear her. But as soon as she said it, Meliora turned and ran back to the car, jumped into her seat without a word, slammed the door shut, and began fastening her seatbelt. When I looked back, the doorway where Alethea had been standing was empty, and I assumed she'd gone back inside. I would have preferred to get in my car and get out of there, but Andorra had a different plan, and she must have been halfway to the door before Meliora could fasten her seatbelt. So I stood there like a lemon for about 10 minutes until Andorra came back. I cast a questioning glance at her as she finally climbed back into the car. In response, I got one of those looks where Andorra seemed to be looking at me, but her eyes quickly darted to the two girls in the back seat. The message was clear. "Shut up and drive. We'll discuss this later." After lunch, we planned to walk along the path along the river and see the waterfalls for which the town was named. We had the impression that the hydroelectric dams had stolen some of their original grandeur, but they were still impressive. As usual on these walks, Andorra and I never overdo hiking if we can help it. The two girls got ahead of us, and that allowed Andorra and me to talk. "So what did she say?" "He left, dumped her 2 years ago when he picked up some waitress in this town." "It's just as we suspected, but I wonder why she didn't go home to the UK. He left, leaving her with the motel bill. The motel was understaffed in the restaurant, so she figured she could stay and work off the bill. Apparently, she's sharing a room with another woman. Anyway, they both work in the restaurant during the day, and at night they serve drinks at the bar behind the road." "Sounds like fun. What else is she supposed to do, Pete? Gets herself laid every night by some barfly, I suppose." "No need to be nasty, Peter. Alethea made a mistake, and now she seems to be paying for it. Anyway, you'll meet her when she finishes her work at the restaurant at 6 o'clock. She only has a couple of hours before she has to be on bar duty, so you can chat while I take the kids out for a bite to eat." And Dora, what the hell am I supposed to tell her? You need to finish, Peter, no matter what you believe. You need to sit down and talk to her and remember that she's Otterly's mother. Do you wish she remembered that? Alethea said the same thing, Peter. She regrets her actions, and I believe she would like to apologize to Otterly as well as to you. Unfortunately, I don't think Otterly is ready to accept that apology just yet. That was obvious from what happened at lunch, but in time, I'm sure she will. We'll just have to make sure we don't lose her again. Are you being magnanimous about all this, considering what Tony did to you? Pete, is there any point in going through life with hate in your heart? What Tony did to me is worse than what Alethea did to you, or even Otterly. You know, for a while I hated him and the other women he tricked into marrying him. And then one day we were all sitting in the waiting room at the police station, and I realized we were all in the same boat. We had all been tricked, and none of us were to blame, so we became friends. Tony, what's the point of wasting time cursing the bastard? If he ever shows up, I'll report him to the police as soon as I get the chance. But I'm not going to waste time and emotion on hating him. I have more important people to worry about. And Dora pulled me to her and kissed my cheek. Besides, think about it. If Alethea hadn't run off with that what's-his-name, where would we be now? Good idea, Andorra. I know it is, my love. We'd better hurry, it's 4 o'clock now. I was waiting in the parking lot of the restaurant when Alethea came off duty. She came out with another very dark-haired woman who scrutinized me carefully before going on her way. Alethea looked nervous, not the confident woman I had last seen in the kitchen when she was laying down the law all those years ago. She still looked quite attractive, though. "Hi, Peter. Thanks for coming over. The bar must be quiet at this time of day. Why don't we go over there and talk?" I didn't speak in response, but gestured for her to take the initiative. I followed Alethea to a booth at the back of the bar. It was obvious that we were expected. I noticed the dark-haired woman sitting behind the bar, talking to the bartender as we entered. Alethea and I sat down, and I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the conversation ahead. I also noticed that all the booths next to ours were empty. A dark-haired woman walked behind us and set 2 beers on the table, then said something to Alethea, I think in Spanish. Alethea only nodded in response. I assumed she had picked up the language during her wanderings. "You wanted to see me, Alethea," I said, reminding her that I had not asked for this meeting. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry, Peter," she finally whispered. I only now caught her words. "No, you have done me a great favor," I replied. "Come on, I'm not cut out to be a bloodthirsty diplomat." "Yes, and Dora got the better end of the deal. I should have realized that she'd latch on to you as soon as I left," she replied bitterly. "It was the other way around, Alethea. As soon as I laid eyes on Andorra," I trailed off, unsure how I wanted to end that sentence. Perhaps I thought that if I had met Andorra before Alethea left, I might have been the one to perform the act of walking out. Maybe it was wishful thinking, but somehow I doubted I would have done that. I'm the kind of person who is too bound by duty and other things to act so selfishly. Sometimes you wonder if this is a failure. "What happened to Loverboy after all?" I asked Alethea. "And where did that creep get all his money? You know he left his wife and kids without a penny, so she seized all his bank accounts. Ronald's money? What a laugh. You mean everybody else's money? He was a crook. He's wanted everywhere. I wouldn't be surprised if that's why he left me in the end. I helped him in some of his scams, and we had to leave Argentina quickly when my picture was in the local papers. I think he crossed the border into Canada when he found out the FBI showed up at the motel looking for him. Coincidentally, with one of the waitresses from the diner. Ironically, I'm now doing the job of that bleeding waitress. Wasn't the FBI after you? No, pretty much yes, but I made a deal with them. If I'm willing to testify against Ronald when they get to him, then they agreed not to throw the book at me. And in return, I got a slap on the wrist. 2 years probation for aiding a fugitive to escape or some other nonsense. Mind you, I'm stuck in the country until they find the creep, and I'll have to report to the authorities every week or so. I took a long sip of my beer, contemplating everything she had just revealed. So, You're stuck here, working in a diner, waiting for the FBI to catch Ronald. That sounds rough." Alethea sighed deeply, her bitterness evident. "It's my own doing, Peter. I made my bed, and now I have to lie in it. I just wanted to apologize to you and Meliora. I know I can't make up for what I did, but I needed to say it." "Apologies are all well and good, Alethea, but actions speak louder than words. What are you planning to do now?" "I'm planning to keep my head down, work hard, and try to rebuild my life. If there's any chance, I'd like to be part of Meliora's life again, even if it's just a small part. That's going to take a lot of time and effort. Meliora was hurt deeply by your actions. She's strong, but trust is something that takes a long time to rebuild." "I know, Peter, and I'm willing to put in the time. I just hope she can eventually forgive me." I nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her situation. "We'll see how things go, Alethea. For now, let's take it one step at a time." We finished our beers in relative silence, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future hanging heavily in the air. As we stood up to leave, I could see the glimmer of hope in Alethea's eyes, a small spark that maybe, just maybe, things could be set right in time. "Take care of yourself, Alethea, and be patient. These things don't heal overnight." "I will, Peter. Thank you for listening." We parted ways, and as I walked back to the car where Andorra and the girls were waiting, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: relief, sorrow, and a cautious optimism that maybe, just maybe, the future held better days for all of us. But it doesn't interfere too much because Buster, the deputy sheriff I report to, is here or at the diner most of the time. "Are you still in debt?" I was up to my ass in it. Like a prune, I signed over almost everything, including Ronald's rental car, and the bitch drove off in it. I've almost paid it all off, but there's still a few $1,000s of debt left. "No, Pete, I can't." Alethea saw me pull out my checkbook. "For once in your life, do as you're told, Alethea." "Okay, I'll draw this up for £5,000. That's $10,000. That should get you out of debt and give you something to lean on if you need it. If you decide to return to the UK in the future, when and if they catch this creep, we'll help you find a place and get settled. But don't think that gives you the right to interfere and spoil our family. And you know the courts have stripped you of all parental rights to Otterly, don't you?" She made that clear to me this morning. I'm sorry, that's not why we sent her. That's what I realized when Andorra walked into the kitchen. "Pete, I was stupid. I really never meant to hurt you and Otterly like that. I don't know, I just got confused by all of Ronald's exciting stories. It wasn't very interesting, I assure you." "Alethea, that was all a long time ago. To tell you the truth, I'm just glad you're safe and sound. But Otterly and I have a new life now, and I'm afraid you are no longer a part of it, though Andorra and I will try to make sure Otterly keeps in touch with you." "That's more than I deserve, Peter, and I really don't deserve this check." "Well, you'd better take it. It will ease my conscience a little when we leave here tomorrow. In the morning, we shall come to the diner for breakfast. Perhaps we can get Otterly to speak to you civilly once more." "I don't deserve the kindness you show me, Peter." "No, Alethea, I had to make my point, even if I tried to convince myself otherwise. But you're Otterly's mother, and there's nothing I can do about it. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to my family." "Sure, I'm sorry, Pete." I got up and walked away without looking back. When I tracked down the girls, you could say they were all waiting for me, breathless. I think that's the right expression. I took Andorra aside and told her briefly about my conversation with Alethea and the money I'd given her. "She doesn't deserve you." That was Andorra's only comment when I mentioned the check. "That's pretty much what she said," I replied, kissing my wife. "But you want to." "Thank you," was all she replied to the remark. A little later, I contacted Otterly alone and was about to start the routine on "You only have one birth mother," when she informed me that Andorra and Brian had already arrived. From that point on, the conversation didn't go as I had planned. Otterly informed me that she would now be glad to talk to her mother the next morning and would also try to keep her mouth shut. She added the condition that she would not be alone with her mother and Brian, or I would have to be present with her. When I inquired why, I was curtly informed that one of us was always present during the fun. I don't know how I took that statement. I left it without comment. The The next morning, Alethea, Otterly, and Brian sat at a nearby table and talked for a long time. I can only assume that Alethea's friends were covering for her because I'm sure she had work to do. The only part of the conversation that Andorra and I overheard was two kids raving about how well the roses were growing in the garden at their house. Anyway, all three of them had smiles on their faces most of the time. As we drove away, Alethea walked to the car with us and kissed both girls goodbye. She then turned to Andorra and me. "These two are very lucky. They have found themselves the best mom and dad in the world," she said, somewhat taking me by surprise, and then turned and ran back into the restaurant. I guess she cried on the run. I kissed my wife. Then we got in the car and drove north to the border in Calgary. From the way they were looking in the rearview mirror, I don't think any of the kids were looking back or were particularly concerned that we had left this town behind. Epilogue. After we returned home that year, Alethea kept in touch with Andorra and made a habit of writing to her fairly regularly, I believe. We never found out if the FBI had tracked Ronald down. But less than a year later, we learned that Alethea was going to marry her deputy sheriff, or whatever his name was. We had a family gathering, and after much heartache, it was decided that we would decline the invitation to attend Alethea's wedding. But I managed to slip in there alone for a few days to attend. Don't ask me why, but for some reason, I felt I had to do it. Buster, or Buddy, as everyone called him, was waiting for me at the small church. Buddy turned out to be a really nice guy once I got to know him better. He even picked me up at the airport and introduced me to all his friends and family. I learned from Buddy that Alethea had been very frank and open with him from the beginning. She admitted to everything she had done and told him how much she regretted what she had done in the past. It turned out that Buddy had arranged with several of his trucker buddies to send her Christmas cards, etc., to us from various cities in Canada. I believe Alethea was trying to hide from us the true circumstances she was in. It's a little weird to give your ex-wife away at her wedding, but I guess some idiot had to do the job. Maybe that's why I went, to kind of put a stop to the whole thing. I don't believe Meliora and Brian figured out where I'd gone for those 5 days, but they could have. Those two were always one step ahead of me in just about everything. To be honest, they and Andorra still are. Over the next few years, we received news that Alethea had given birth to 2 boys. We never saw them, though, except in pictures. Now that they are a little older, I believe the boys have fairly regular contact with Meliora and Brian, but neither of my daughters mentioned them or Alethea to me very often. Meliora and Brian ended up marrying 2 brothers. Sometimes I feel really sorry for these poor girls. The girls are still incredibly close to each other and definitely play a major role in these marriages. When our 2 girls are scheming together, it takes a man to come out on top. I don't think I've ever been able to do that. They both have 2 children, and suspiciously, from my point of view, in both cases, the girls were born remarkably close to each other, both in date and physically. Andorra and I have enjoyed watching our grandchildren grow up and become very much like their mothers. I retired as managing director last year, and Andorra and I are now enjoying an 8-month round-the-world trip. We've been pondering whether we'll find somewhere we'll want to settle down. But to be honest, I think our daughters and their families will pull us home to the UK again. We haven't sold the house. The girls wouldn't let us because of the roses. God knows how much time they spend there attending to it all, but we get regular reports. Just this morning, while checking the mail, I got a picture of my garden from them titled, "It's been a good year for roses." Life goes on. That's it.